Hello and welcome to CWJah Talk number 28. My name is Greg Stafford, and a year ago I started to upload videos to this channel to try to give people a better perspective on what the Bible teaches and what is the corroborating evidence that we have available today for what it describes. One of the series of videos that I started in uploading videos to this channel is one that focused on the pre-Christian evidence that we have that I believe points uniquely to Jesus as the biblical Messiah, or the one whom many of these ancient biblical texts refer to as a Savior, as someone whom God would send to save humankind from death. Most of the texts that I have focused on in that series have manuscript support that's datable universally to a time before Jesus was born. And so I believe it provides unique evidence, not only in terms of what it says, what it teaches, that we find uniquely fulfilled in Jesus, but that the dating of the texts that teach these things and that were in the possession of people like the Jews before Jesus was born adds further credibility to the association between these ancient texts and Jesus, or what is said to have occurred when he was alive. Not every text that we use as pre-Christian evidence pointing to Jesus as the Messiah has manuscript support datable to before the time he was alive. Most of them do. But for example, in our video on Psalm 110:1, while it's not a psalm that has manuscript support datable universally to the time before Jesus was born, neither Jews nor Christians in the Masoretic biblical text tradition or in the Greek Septuagint biblical text tradition disagree as to including Psalm 110:1 in the biblical Psalms. We just don't have specific support for that verse that's dated universally to before the time Jesus was born in, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the same with the text we're going to consider today from Genesis 3:15. While we don't have manuscript evidence that can be universally dated to before the time Jesus was born, we do have manuscript evidence to most of the texts surrounding it. And it, like Psalm 110:1, is included in both the Masoretic biblical text tradition, the Jewish non-Christian biblical tradition, and in the Christian Greek Septuagint versions that we have. So there's no dispute in terms of what Genesis 3:15 says in the biblical text. We just don't have a specific text in, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls or in other texts, datable to a time before Jesus was born. Nonetheless, it's still believed to have been a part of the texts that were in use when Jesus was alive. We do have texts datable to before the time Jesus was born for the verses right before Genesis 3:15. For example, 1Q1 Genesis, I'll show you images of it right here, provides us with pre-Christian evidence, or pretty close to it, to the time of the first century or in the first century BCE, of Genesis 3:11 through 14, right up into the verse that we're going to consider today, verse 15. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we do have biblical support unanimously between Christians and Jews for Genesis 3:15 itself. And even in the Jewish Targum tradition, which is the Aramaic translations of the biblical text by the Jews, usually dated to the time from the 2nd century forward. The Jerusalem Targum tradition, as distinguished from the Babylonian Targum tradition, clearly associates Genesis 3:15 in the Jewish Jerusalem Targum tradition with the days of the Messiah. And I'll share the specific reading of the Jerusalem Targum tradition with you after we read Genesis 3:15 in one of the more common English translations of the Masoretic Text. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take a look at Genesis 3:15. I'll be reading from the New World Translation because I have not translated every text, and I'm very familiar with the New World Translation, and so I can comment on it if necessary. So Genesis 3:15. Now, if you've been joining me for our day text shows, We've gone through the days of creation. We went through the first part of Genesis 3, but because I have not translated all of Genesis 3, we skipped forward to part of Genesis 5, and then we started with Genesis 6:1, and now we're in Genesis 7, and the time right before the flood. But getting back to Genesis 3, let's go ahead and read, excuse me, the New World Translation of Genesis 3:15. And then I'll share with you the Jerusalem Targumic tradition, and we'll make a comparison. So Genesis 3:15, right after Adam and Eve eat from the tree from which JahWah told them not to eat because they were not yet ready to make choices on their own, apart from what JahWah was telling them what to do. The first thing of which was not to eat from this tree, so that they would know what's right and wrong without actually having to do it. But once they chose to eat from that tree, and listened to what the serpent told them in defiance of Jah, now they were making choices like putting clothes on and hiding from him as if ashamed, since they were, now that they, in their view, were naked and their vanity was taking hold. So none of this was what JahWah wanted. But after it had been introduced and they had made choices on their own, since this is what they were made to do in his image, JahWah then addressed the serpent and Adam and Eve, and in verse 15, this is part of what he said, speaking to the serpent. And I shall put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will bruise you in the head, and you will bruise him in the heel, which is commonly an association made between a fatal blow and a non-fatal blow. And the description made here is one that we literally do find ourselves in today whenever we, for example, as humans, encounter a serpent. It's looking up at us and typically would be concerned about our foot unless we had other weapons, because that's what we'd use to block or even try to hit it. And we're concerned about its head, right, where its fangs are and where its venom could be. So it's describing the association that we see and have seen since this time. And then metaphorically, we believe it also represents the enmity that has existed between the children of Adam and Eve and the children of the serpent. And that's consistent with Jesus' illustration of the Son of Man and the wicked one, who are described as sowing seed in the earth. And so we'll talk more about that in a moment when we get to some of the New Testament texts, but focusing again first on Genesis. So Genesis 3:15, right after Adam and Eve and the serpent disobey and disrespect JahWah and do what he told them not to do, he addresses them and he speaks of a seed that would come through the woman that would deliver a fatal blow to the serpent. All the while the serpent would be delivering these bruising and damaging blows to the heel of the woman's seed, or the serpent's seed would be doing this as well, and is part of what would involve the serpent. So the Greek Septuagint uses a little bit softer term, tereo, which is more of a watching out for, a protecting against, but that would nonetheless still potentially involve some kind of offense, since in any kind of protection or guarding against something deadly or coming at you to damage you, you would naturally, even in blocking, attempt to subdue it. And so I wanted to point that out, though, since it's a bit softer from the sense it's communicated in the Hebrew text for bruising. So now, if we look at the Jerusalem Targum tradition, or the Aramaic translations of the Jews, datable mostly from the time of the 2nd century forward, the way that it translates Genesis 3:15, it adds more terms in order to explain how it understands these things than the Masoretic text that we just read. It says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between the offspring of your children and the offspring of her children. And when the children of the woman keep the commandments of the law, they will take aim and strike you on your head. But when they forsake the commandments of the law, you will take aim and wound them on their heels. For them, however, there will be a remedy, but for you there will be no remedy. And they are to make peace in the end, in the days of the King Messiah. And so while the Jerusalem Targum texts clearly interpret more of what Genesis 3:15 is saying in the context of their understanding and rabbinic thought at that time, they also associate it directly with the days of King Messiah. And so both Jews and Christians have historically seen Genesis 3:15 as involving the Messiah, the one who would come, and as the text itself says, would bruise the head of the serpent that misled our first parents and caused them to introduce error and death. So this association of a seed is then carried through the book of Genesis, through to people like Abraham from Ur in ancient Mesopotamia, who was told that he would have a seed that would be so numerous that no one would be able to count how many children he would eventually have. And so then Abraham, through his son Isaac, and through Isaac's son Jacob, produced the children of Israel. And the biblical texts that go through all of the events associated with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob then bring us into the period of time when Joseph was governor of Egypt and the Hebrews were enslaved there for hundreds of years before Yahweh used Moses to free them and to eventually bring them into the promised land. And there was established a kingdom and a lineage. And it was through David that it was said the Messiah would come. David is associated with the Messiah, for example, in texts like Psalm 110:1 and Psalm 2. And so, in other biblical texts, once we go beyond Genesis and the seed of Genesis 3:15, and then the seed promised to Abraham, and then the seed which comes to be through Isaac and Jacob and the children of Israel. And then we proceed through accounts like the Exodus and Moses. And we get to the time when Israel has been established and is going through various conflicts internally and externally. And we get to, for example, books like Isaiah. There is further reference and association to the Messiah and a seed. So, for example, if we go back to the New World Translation, we'll take a look at Isaiah chapter 6. You can follow along with me in whatever text you have. But notice this, Isaiah chapter 6, the first part of Isaiah 6, it's Isaiah in a vision. And one of the seraphs, the heavenly angels, has to come to him and burn his tongue with a hot coal to purify him from his sin so he can stay present and hear the things said. Now, in verse 13, it speaks of a time when there would be a stump or a holy seed. And then, of course, in Isaiah chapter 7, it goes on to describe the time when the maiden herself would become pregnant, the text we all are mostly familiar with if we're readers of the biblical text, Isaiah 7:14, Emmanuel. And so we go from Isaiah 6 and its reference to a stump in Isaiah 6:13, a holy seed being the stump of what remains, to Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14 and to the prophecy of Emmanuel, which Jews will often associate with either Hezekiah or the house of David, which in the New Testament is associated with Jesus and his birth, with God being with us through him, just like he says over and over when he's on earth. And then, so we're in Isaiah 7:14, where the prophecy about Emmanuel is given. And then further, in Isaiah chapter, let's go to chapter 11. Some of these texts we've read before as part of our other shows involving pre-Christian evidence, like Isaiah 9:6. So some of this may be familiar to you, but in Isaiah chapter 11, it speaks about a twig. Now remember, Genesis 3:15 speaks of a seed. And then we also see reference made to the seed of Abraham, seed of Isaac, Jacob, the children of Israel. Then we see reference to a holy seed, Isaiah 6, the birth of Emmanuel. And then now in Isaiah 11:1, there must go forth a twig out of the stump of Jesse, and out of his roots a sprout will be fruitful, Jesse being the father of King David. And then in verse 10, these texts in Isaiah 11 go on to describe things that, in our view, clearly refer to a future time, apart from any past time, because it speaks of things that have never happened, like the wolf lying down with the lamb. And it speaks of a time when this one who's a twig out of the stump of Jesse, would not judge by any mere appearance of the eyes, nor prove by anything according to what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he judges the lowly ones, with uprightness. And then here's where it speaks of the wolf residing with the lamb, the kid with the leopard, the calf with the main lion. And then in verse 9 it says, they'll not do any harm or cause any ruin in all my holy mountain, because the earth will certainly be filled with the knowledge of Jehovah, as the waters are covering the very sea. And then in verse 10 it says, and it must occur in that day, there will be the root of Jesse that will be standing up as a signal for the peoples. To him, even the nations will turn inquiringly, and his resting place must become glorious. Here we have it all. Here we have the reference to the twig out of the stump of Jesse, which comes from the seed, ultimately or originally foretold in Genesis 3:15, and then further through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the children of Israel, the line of David, that would come forward with the spirit of Jehovah and bring about peaceful conditions for the entire earth. And it says specifically, even the nations will turn to him. And then it refers to his resting place as being glorious. All of these things find association with Jesus in the New Testament writings, with the things that he said to have come and done, with his giving of his life in service to Jehovah and faithfulness, and to whom all the nations have turned inquiringly, not just the Jews, as part of the text that we're reading about and the things that they were expecting before Jesus was born. And then of the time that he would come again and bring about these conditions, because of course, obviously he can't bring about all these things while he's resting in death. So there was a difference, an association between different times when different things would take place. But all of it in association with the root of Jesse, with the twig out of the stump of Jesse, which is the same as the seed the holy seed that would be the stump left over in the land that would then grow like a big, massive tree. So, and of course, Jehovah's judgments would then be executed. Either way, the consistency shown here appears clear to me that the holy seed that would be the stump of it is also the child of promise, Emmanuel, who is spoken of further as the one who would come through Jesse, the twig out of the stump of Jesse, that would bring about earth-wide peace and the knowledge of Jehovah as the waters are covering the very sea, in the day when the one who is the root of Jesse stands up as a signal, and even his resting place will be glorious. So all of these things we find consistent with the life, death, resurrection, and return of Jesus of Nazareth. Now let's go to another biblical text, part of which we've again considered in our other shows on the pre-Christian evidence involving Jesus as the biblical Messiah, and that's Zechariah 3:8. Let's take a look at that. I'll give you a chance to turn there as I scroll down myself. So it's near the end of the Hebrew Old Testament texts. Zechariah 3. Let's take a look at verses 8 and 9. Notice here it says in verse 8, we've read this before in association with our text, as I mentioned, but I'm going to use it in association with the seed and the twig and the stump and root of Jesse. Hear, please, O Joshua the high priest, you and your companions who are sitting before you, for they are men serving as portents. For here I am bringing in my servant Sprout. Verse 9, for look, the stone that I put before Joshua, upon the stones there are 7 eyes. Here I am engraving its engraving as the utterance of Jehovah of armies, and I will take away the error of that land in one day. Now let's jump down to Zechariah 6:13. We don't need to read all of the text because I want to focus on specific points. So we have, just to make sure that everyone understands, verse 8, so you and your companions, they're serving as signs and portents as he's bringing in Sprout. So what's being said here of Joshua the high priest and his companions isn't just for them. They're serving as portents for someone else. And I've talked about previously, as I mentioned, how these also apply to Jesus as the king priest. This was part of our Psalm 110:1 show, because of the crown being put on the head of the high priest Joshua and him serving as a portent for Sprout. But now I'm connecting Sprout with the text in Genesis 3:15 through to the other texts in which Yahuwah promises a seed, and into Isaiah, where the twig, the root, and stump of Jesse is again associated with the time of the Messiah. And now here where we get the high priest Joshua serving with his companions as a portent for Sprout. Now let's go down to verse 13 of chapter 6, where it says, he himself will build the temple of Jehovah, and he for his part will carry the dignity, and he must sit down and rule on his throne, and he must become a priest on his throne, and the very counsel of peace will prove to be between both of them, the kingship and his priestly function. Remember, Joshua is serving as a portent for Sprout. And this is the king-priest function of the Messiah that we read about in the New Testament writings, as well as in Psalm 110:1, a priest forever according to the manner of Melchizedek. And so, in this case, it's again referring to, it not only refers to him in his king-priest function, and again, this is all associated back with the seed in Genesis 3:15 that will crush the head of the serpent as these things occur, but it says the very counsel of peace will prove to be between his kingly and priestly functions. And what does Isaiah 9:6 say? We went through Isaiah 6, we went through Isaiah 7, then we went through Isaiah 11, but Isaiah 9:6 specifically refers, in our view, again, to the one who would come through the line of David as the Messiah, the angel of great counsel, according to the Greek translations, because it identifies the El Gibor, or mighty God, used in the Hebrew text as an angel. That's how they understood that reference, just like they understand angels for other references to gods in the Hebrew texts. So, and he's also called Prince of Peace in that text of Isaiah 9. So all of these things, again, are consistent, not only with what is associated with the Messiah in all of these texts apart from Genesis 3, but with Genesis 3 and the seed that would be a holy seed of the stump, the twig that would come through Jesse. And as it says here in verse 12, you must say to him, this is what Jehovah has said. Here is the man whose name is Sprout, and from his own place he will sprout, and he will certainly build the temple of Jehovah. And it says it again, he will build the temple of Jehovah. And what does Jesus say in the New Testament? Break down this temple, and in 3 days I'll build it up. So Jesus is definitely associated with these events and ways that find association not only with things like building the temple, but with his king-priest function, with the seed, the root, the twig, the stump that was foretold in Genesis 3:15, that was promised to Abraham and his offspring, and then through the line of David and the children of Israel, who was represented here by Joshua and his companions, who stand as portents for Sprout, the one who would stand up and build the temple of Yahuwah, who would sit down and rule on his throne as a king priest, just like Psalm 110:1 says, and who would have the very counsel of peace, just like the Spirit of Jehovah settling down on the one spoken of in Isaiah 11, and the descriptions of Isaiah 9:6. So all of these things are consistent from Genesis 3 to Zechariah 6. But let's take a look at a little bit more. Zechariah 8:12, which goes on to say, first Jehovah, well, he's speaking further, and he's talking about the end times, but some people might view it as the end times in those days. Either way, notice what it says in verse 12. There will be the seed of peace, the seed of peace, and the vine itself will give its fruitage, and the earth itself will give its yield, and the heavens will give their due. And I shall certainly cause the remaining ones of this people to inherit these things. So these are all the promises that are associated with the Messiah, both in terms of the original foretelling of the seed and the effect it would have on the serpent, bruise it in the head, and the sprouting through the line of David that would occur as portended through Joshua the high priest and his companions, that this one would stand up as a king priest and all the nations would turn to inquiringly, and he would even have a glorious resting place before the time when the earth would be restored to having the knowledge of Jehovah at every shore. And in the New Testament, these texts are further associated, this idea of a seed, and developed. If you take a look, for example, in the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul, we refer to him as the Apostle Paul, and of course he was a Jew, a Pharisee, someone who originally persecuted Christians. And he wrote extensively once he converted. And in Romans chapter 1, he starts out this letter to Roman Christians by saying, Paul, slave of Jesus Christ, and called to be an apostle, separated to God's good news, which he promised aforetime through his prophets and holy scriptures, like the ones we've been reading, concerning his Son, who sprang from the seed of David, according to the flesh, but who with power was declared God's Son according to the Spirit of holiness, by means of a resurrection from the dead. Yes, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we received undeserved kindness and an apostleship, in order that there might be obedience of faith among the nations respecting his name. And this is consistent with what we read about all the nations turning to look at this one inquiringly sprout, the twig, the holy seed of the stump of Jesse, through the line of David, the king priest like Melchizedek. Now let's turn to one last text, also written by the Apostle Paul, someone who quoted extensively from the Hebrew texts to do much like what we're doing and show why we believe Jesus is the fulfillment of this all, why he's the one and those associated with him who will bring an end to the things that the wicked one and those who follow him unleashed into this earth. Turn with me, if you don't mind, to Galatians chapter 3. You can follow along or we'll read together. Galatians chapter 3, and we'll read verses 16 through 20. And it says, now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed, as I've referenced several times, and as you can read in the book of Genesis from 18 forward. It says not, and to seeds, as in the case of many, but as in the case of one, just like Genesis 3:15, your seed, and to your seed, who is Christ. Verse 17, further I say this, as to the covenant previously validated by God, the law that has come into being 430 years later does not invalidate it, so as to abolish the promise. Remember, the promise was made to Abraham before there was a law. And that's what he's getting at. Verse 18, for if the inheritance is due to law, it's no longer due to a promise. whereas God has kindly given it to Abraham through a promise. Why then the law? It was added to make transgressions manifest, until the seed should arrive, to whom the promise had been made. And it was transmitted through angels by the hand of a mediator. Now there is no mediator where only one person is concerned, but God is only one. I think that pretty much ends the Trinity, because if God is three persons, then this text would not apply. Getting back to our subject, verse 21, is the law therefore against the promises of God? May that never happen. For if a law had been given that was not able to give life, righteousness would actually have been by means of law. Verse 22, but the scriptures delivered up all things together to the custody of sin, that the promise resulting from faith toward Jesus Christ might be given to those exercising faith. And then if you look at verse 29, moreover, if you belong to Christ, you are really Abraham's seed, heirs with reference to a promise, not by law. And so this is how Christians interpret this seed of Genesis 3:15 that was also then promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to their children, and through the line of David, we believe came and was fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth. We don't just believe that because it makes us feel good. We don't just believe that because our parents told us that's what we should do. We believe Jesus is the Messiah, or the one whom God actually prepared and sent forward to teach us how we can live and have a relationship with him, because we believe that's what he did. We believe in the flood as a real event because of the evidence that we have which corroborates it. In the same way, when we talk about Jesus as the Messiah, we're primarily referring to the pre-Christian evidence we have, whether it's in texts that are datable to a time before he even arrived or was born on earth, which speak about things that are uniquely fulfilled in him according to numerous other texts written and datable to close to that very same time, that describe things in ways that are very unique, would be almost impossible to just make up as fulfillment of all of these things that these people were expecting since the time of Adam and Eve, since the time of Noah, since the time of Moses. And we believe since the time of Jesus, this seed has been helping humans to stand against the seed of the wicked one. In fact, our last text, let's take a look. Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 through 17, speaks specifically of the time after Jesus came, lived, and died, and what we should be expecting. Revelation chapter 3, Revelation chapter 12. I had to get my little cursor up there. So Revelation 12, and we're going to read verses 13 through 17, and then we'll conclude. I thank you all for joining me today. It's good to be back with our day text shows and with our CWJah Talk shows. I'm taking off tomorrow, but I'll be back Tuesday as we continue to work our way through Genesis. Now let's read our last text. Again, what should we be expecting, or what is it that at least the Christians from the first century wrote down that we should be expecting as it pertains to this seed that we've been reading about since the time of Adam and Eve? Revelation 12:13 through 17. Now when the dragon saw that it was hurled down to the earth, this is right after Michael the archangel throws down the dragon from heaven. Michael and his angels battle with the dragon and his angels, and they defeat him and throw him out of heaven. So now the dragon is confined to the earth. And it says, when the dragon saw it was hurled down to the earth, it persecuted the woman that gave birth to the male child. So this is after the Messiah had already come. Verse 14, but the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place. This is where she is fed for a time and times and half a time, away from the face of the serpent. Verse 15, and the serpent disgorged water like a river from its mouth after the woman, to cause her to be drowned by the river. Verse 16, but the earth came to the woman's help, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the river that the dragon disgorged from its mouth. Verse 17, and the dragon grew wrathful at the woman. So the dragon attacked the woman first. Then the earth came, helped the woman, diverted the dragon's attack. Verse 17, after this, after the earth diverted the attack away from the woman, the dragon gets upset at the woman and goes off to wage war with the remaining ones of her seed. I shall put enmity between you and the woman, and between her seed and your seed. Who's the woman's seed? Last part of verse 17. Those who observe the commandments of God and have the work of bearing witness to Jesus. So in a Christian application of Genesis 3:15, we believe all Christians who have committed themselves to following Jesus and his teachings in order to please Jehovah the Father are a part of the seed that will eventually bring an end to the serpent, are a part of the seed that was made a promise to Abraham, and through whom that promise was fulfilled by Jehovah in the person of Jesus of Nazareth.